Scott Moore is a co-founder of Gitcoin, which is a Web3 community focused on building and sustaining digital public goods. He's also helped push forward a number of other related initiatives, such as the Digital Public Goods Alliance, some Ethereum Foundation grants, and Sustain OSS. And on top of that, he's just a world-class guy. Always appreciate catching up with Scott whenever I have the chance. And today he's going to be talking to us. I'm actually really excited about his talk. It's called Ethereum is Solarpunk, Reimagining Public Goods. So Scott, if you don't mind turning your camera and mic on.
How's this?
Hey, buddy. Perfect. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Yeah, I got my ChainSafe shirt just to be on brand.
For sure. Really appreciate that, dude.
Should I have my slides, or does that happen?
Yeah. So if you don't mind sharing your screen, and we can get the slides up there, and then I can give you the stage.
Perfect. Let me share just the tab, just so you don't see a million
that's perfect.
tabs I have.
That's usually my go-to.
Yeah. How does this look? Is this?
That's perfect, dude. Yeah, you're good to go. Take it away, my friend.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much to everyone for being here in sort of the metaverse that we're all in. It's actually very fitting that we're just getting to winter here in Canada, and we're sort of talking about a very summer theme. This is actually an iteration of a talk that Kevin gave, and I was almost convinced to call it Web3 Solarpunk in this context, but it occurred to me that, Ethereum is really our home. It has historically been our home, although we do work with a lot of other chains as well. And I think there's something to the original ethos of Ethereum and the Ethereum ecosystem that really stands out on its own. And I think it's something that other ecosystems have started to envelop themselves in as well. But it is this sort of general solarpunk idea, which I remember from when I got into the space in 2015, 2016, which feels like a long time ago now. But for those of you who don't know, solarpunk is this sort of artistic movement around what the future might look like if humanity succeeded in solving its core coordination problems. We sort of work together more actively with our environment, with technology, versus cyberpunk, which tends to be a little bit more dystopian. You don't see a lot of very positive, happy-go-lucky cyberpunk films. And it's partly because it's a very kind of high-tech, low-life combination. And then, of course, there's cypherpunk, which we're all sort of familiar with from the early eras of the internet, which kind of, takes a more solely technical stance. It doesn't really have a sort of speculative fiction, or at least it has, I guess you could argue it has some degree of speculative fiction behind it, but it really is more a direct movement within the context of, the sort of 90s, 2000s and beyond. Well, technically a little bit before that as well, but we'll kind of ignore cypherpunk for this particular talk and mostly kind of focus in on why we should focus on solarpunk versus cyberpunk. And so I think that the biggest challenge of cyberpunk is mostly that it's largely pessimistic. We regard sort of most of the things we see as cyberpunk as gritty, kind of fascinating to look at and more realistic, but fundamentally because I think we have this natural pessimism about where we're going as a society increasingly over the last few decades. And I think that one of the important things for us to realize is that technology is just a tool. It gives us opportunities, it gives us choices, and we have to make those choices in social context. We can't just let technology be co-opted by, monopolies or by corporate interests in the sense that you might see in cyberpunk worlds. And so solarpunk is a much more, as I mentioned, optimistic and kind of fundamentally high-tech, high-life sort of model. And it emphasizes this sort of connection that we have with each other, with our environment. And it's something that I think we don't often talk about. One thing I'll get into in a little bit is the work of Ivan Illich and some of his philosophies around the role of institutions in sort of society at large, but also it's relevant in the context of Web3 and the role of institutions in Web3. But what he talks about is that, we often see ourselves as distinct from our environment. We often see this sort of like almost skin that like separates us from the outside world. And I think when we do that, we often make the mistake of assuming that like we don't really need to worry about it. I've actually been very heartened to see over the last sort of 6 to 12 months, there's a lot more people thinking about, what is the relationship of Web3 with the broader environment. We've got a lot of like really cool climate projects that are actually part of Gitcoin grants round 12, which kicked off yesterday. And I think that's part of this movement towards some of the principles that a lot of folks in the space have already embodied around like conservation, self-sustainability, and social inclusiveness. But so in particular, I think the reason Solarpunk is relevant to bring up now is that we're at this precipice in the space where it's, everyone's very excited about Web3, everyone's very excited about Ethereum, everyone's very excited about where we could go, but everyone has a slightly different view of the directions that we might take. And I think what that means for us is that we have this risk of, a real coordination failure around the futures we want to see. And those futures will be largely separate from, the historical baggage of previous means of coordination. Things like, even nation states or things like corporations, I think are not necessarily going to go away anytime soon, and nor should they. But like they're fundamentally one way of coordinating. They are just people that decided at one point, almost arbitrarily to some degree, to get together, decide on a mechanism for coordination, decide on a system for voting and governance, and then decide on a means for transacting value. And that's actually what Polanyi calls sort of like the rise of the market society in his book, The Great Transformation, where we moved from tribes, clans, smaller sort of like units of collaboration, which were largely actually consensus driven. The more modern examples of this sort of way of governing would be the IETF, which actually is a great use, like kind of example case of the ideas there. But the way in which we now sort of think about things is largely market-based. It's largely market-based in the context of increasingly large institutions. And what that means is that we run into this problem where we fundamentally lose this sense of, optionality, or the sense that we can have, choices about the ways in which we coordinate economically. And of course, I think as we all know here, that's no longer true, that we're stuck with that, those models. We have other models we can pursue. And in particular, those models are less institutional, more abstracted, and more collective, with sort of networks that we're building in Web3. And those networks tend to be global by default. They tend to be open by default. And they tend to have a lot of these features in which we could call Solarpunk, in the sense that they are directly connecting us with each other, with our environment, without any of these intermediaries or sort of skins that are like effectively gating our access or a sense of involvement or fluidity with the rest of the space we're involved in. So we need to kind of move, I think, in large part beyond this baggage, beyond the baggage, especially of like the market society, which I think has created this sense of almost, economic trauma for a lot of people, where the idea of economics is now bad. The idea of being paid for your work is bad. The idea of being paid for economic coordination is bad. I think that's like largely due to the way in which we've done these things in the past. And if we take a more Solarpunk approach to those things, I think we can actually make people much more positive about what it means to, one, be an owner, 2, to be economically compensated, and 3, to just like be involved in a broader collective system. So this is kind of our like, alternative, I'll say, to doomerism, for those who are familiar with that term. And we can take back agency and ownership, with this sort of thinking. I mean, it is all thinking. We're all just like kind of collectively with most systems, hallucinating towards some common goal, I would say. And I think that's okay, like that we're doing that. But we have to be very conscious of the fact that we're doing that. And we have to, I think, figure out how to leverage those narratives in ways that, take back ownership and agency over institutions that actually allow us to coordinate versus to become insular, focused on our individual gain, and that allow for new kinds of more cooperative currencies to emerge, as opposed to, for example, much more formally, VC-backed or VC-driven economies. So this is what Kevin calls regen, not degen. We're talking about mechanisms that lift all of us up versus mechanisms that, might get one person some like small amount of basis points on transaction and give them an economic edge. That's the kind of cooperative system that we have historically not really had an option to pursue, but that we could pursue through these kinds of economic networks. And so one of the big things about, the Solarpunk narrative and the way in which we can use these tools that we have is that it redefines the notion of public goods in a way that I don't think was possible before, the rise of these sort of like Web3 networks. And so just for folks that don't know the term public goods, effectively something is defined as a public good if it is not excludable and non-rivalrous. What that means is that anyone can access it at any time. They can't be excluded from it, and it can't be competed for. So my breathing of clean air does not necessarily interfere with your breathing of clean air. And that to me is, a good definition to start, but it misses a lot of interesting dynamics when it comes to, for example, in Web3, things like DAOs. DAOs fundamentally are beholden to token holders. Token holders are not necessarily the public. This is something that Toby Shorn has done a really good job talking about in his piece, Positive Sum Worlds. But we can define public goods in a way that talks to the positive externalities that they are creating and leverages those positive externalities to basically create, more, in this case, obviously arguing for more of a Solarpunk future, but generally a future that we actually want to see. And so if we, view kind of on the one axis market failure and on the other axis value to community, we can kind of get a matrix of where something falls in terms of how public a good is. And so here's an example of Kernel, which is our Web3 incubator, which is, invite only. It has 250 members each cohort. It's actually also open now, so I will quickly show that. But the idea here is that, Kernel might be seen as somewhere around like a 6 on this, particular matrix. And so it has, a relatively high amount of value to community, but because we are sort of restricting access and charging a small fee for people who are being part of it, it does have like some amount of economics and some sustainability. If we were to like totally open it up, totally make it public, that would push it to more of a 9 in the sense that it's a very, very like, public good now. It is totally open to everyone, but it certainly is like less sustainable this way. There's more market failure involved. Similarly, if we were to close it off and, potentially make it, let's say a DAO with very limited access based on a very like high value token or high value NFT, it would be much more sustainable, but it would also be much more closed off to the broader public. And so the concern that I see with the previous framing of public goods is that many of the things we're doing in Web3, are still, in my opinion, or I would say broadly fit the Solarpunk narrative. And they broadly fit the Solarpunk narrative in the sense that they provide very strong positive externalities, although they are, to some degree closed off from any, random person coming in and accessing them, because there's naturally, for a lot of these systems, a capital requirement. And so I think that's, where we have to be very mindful of, what are the positive externalities the organizations that we're involved in produce? And how can we make sure that that is what we're maximizing versus individual gain, which I think the community at large is already very good at. But how can we also make sure that we're measuring that and being careful about how we design systems such as DAOs to be, as much as they can be, public goods? So in my view, this is the like heart of regen finance. This is the heart of like regen, not degen thinking. We have this history of, building a lot of, especially back in like more so like 2016 and now, like a lot of more decentralized casinos. I think there's a lot of things that are not that now, but I think we have to be very cautious of building new models. We have to fundamentally be like moving away from existing financial or institutional models. We have to be experimenting with more cooperative, more localist models, for example. And we can do that with these systems because they're fundamentally about, you know, creating positive externalities rather than creating individual gain. And so that's something that I think we don't talk about enough, which is why I'm talking about it here. And I think that that's what, you know, Regen Finance is to me, and that's why Regen Finance, I think, is Solarpunk, and Ethereum by extension is Solarpunk. And so, yeah, to some degree, you know, I think this is true now. We've moved a little bit beyond these sorts of models that we at one point maybe were more stuck in. But it's partly also, I just want to note, like, an affirmation. Like, we're trying to like manifest this particular reality of like Ethereum and Web3 as more of an inclusive, as more of a sort of positive sum environment. And I think it's really important, just as we like hit mainstream, that we start to think carefully about that. And if we do that, you know, we can be a Schelling point for everyone who also believes that. And historically, I think that's been the reason that a lot of us have gotten into crypto. A lot of us have, you know, started to be excited about this space, is not because of some like cyberpunk, you know, cyberpunk like dystopia, cyberpunk dystopia, again, like not really a lot of speculative fiction there. But like, I think we can actually find a opportunity to, you know, convince other folks who might be skeptical, who might see the hyper financialization of this space, that there are ways to leverage this in a way that actually benefits everybody. And I think that that's the thing that we have to be very mindful of as we hit mainstream, especially because if someone goes from, I don't know what a wallet is, to, I think that we should, you know, be entirely building VC-backed, you know, casinos, then we might lose some of the sort of, you know, ethos that brought many of us to the space. And I think there's a lot of people that are working towards this vision, which is why I feel like it's a really good time to kind of hit this home and to try and make sure that people are building sort of new institutions for a world that historically has been much more sort of you know, closed off, has relied largely on like these two types again of institutions, which have a variety of, you know, historical problems in various different contexts. There's like a lot to dive into, but they really are fundamentally the same, you know, sorts of coordination mechanisms. And so I want to note a few groups that I think are already doing a really good job at this. This is not by any means, you know, exclusive, but ENS, you know, for digital identities, that's a core primitive, I think, and it's public, it's open to everyone. Retroactive public goods funding, which Optimism has done an amazing job with. I think Optimism actually doesn't get enough credit for the innovation of what they're doing in L2 relative to a lot of other L2s, which are not necessarily planning to immediately give back to the community. And then governance, you know, tooling as well with what Gnosis is doing to help projects kind of level up and sustain themselves. And then finally, I wanted to save us for last, Gitcoin, I feel like does kind of embody some of these values, embodies the idea of trying to get back to the community, be positive sum. And I think there's a lot of other projects that do this too. And so I'm kind of, you know, to anyone that's listening from a particular project out there, I would just recommend that you think about, you know, how can your project be more Solarpunk? How can you live up to that, you know, speculative fiction that we all want to see in the world? And how can we make sure that we are pushing forward to a world that we want to see? So we can choose to build a more Solarpunk future, and Ethereum can be and is Solarpunk. Thanks.
Awesome, Scott. That was great, dude. Always appreciate your insights on things. It's really nice to just, like, with all the kind of negativity and division going on in the world right now, kind of having something to potentially bring people together and, you know, have like a happy ending out of all of this, I think is definitely something that is very refreshing. So
Absolutely. And we have the chance to do it. That's the big thing. Like everyone here can do this. Like everyone here can make this happen. So let's do it.
Yeah, totally agree. We do have quite a list of questions for you if you have the time.
Oh yeah, for sure. I didn't know,
cool.
Didn't see those yet.
So just over in the Q&A tab, if you want to check it out yourself, but I'll read them off to you so that everybody on YouTube who's following along can hear them as well. So the first one is, does the idea of regen finance intend to alter game theoristic setups in situations that are inherently adversarial? What's going on there?
I would say yes. Like I think that there are a lot of scenarios that can be transformed from sort of like zero-sum games to positive-sum games. So an example that actually I went through with Matt Stevenson from from a variety of things, but he's part of block science mainly, is the idea of transforming, if you're at a concert and one person stands up in front of you, that person is now blocking your view, then that person, stands up, then the next person stands up. It creates this kind of like chain lightning effect in which everyone just stands up. And that's the worst scenario for everyone. Everyone is worse off than they were when they started. Ultimately, the way that we resolve that is by creating an incentive for one person just to stay sitting down. And that might seem counterintuitive because you're like, in some of those scenarios, potentially incentivizing, you're incentivizing the right behavior, but for the wrong reasons. Like that person should maybe naturally be willing to like stay in the like position where they're helping more people. But what I think we historically made the mistake of is just saying, oh, people will just do the right thing, like for whatever reason. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I think some people will always naturally deviate from that path for whatever reason that is. And I think that if we can create incentives that basically realign those folks, we get to a scenario where everyone is better off. In that, concert example, that's a silly example, obviously, but I think that's a really important part of regen finance is transforming those economics.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of that would come down to maybe like just education, like people not having the intrinsic self-awareness to know that their behaviors are having a negative impact on other people, and just creating resources for them to understand the greater impact of their behavior.
Absolutely. Education is a core part of it. And I think even beyond education, there's ways. So like KlimaDAO is a great example of this, actually. I mean, I don't want to shout out to any particular project, but I will shout out to KlimaDAO because it's fundamentally a very degen model in which you're kind of just like, creating this yield farming system. Yield farming isn't necessarily bad. It's actually like done a lot of really good things too. But the way that KlimaDAO works, I think most people are familiar with it, is that when you're yield farming, you're actually like basically offsetting carbon in the process. And that to me is like a great example of people are participating often in things like that for speculative, maybe zero-sum reasons, but what they're creating is a positive externality. And by creating that positive externality, they're actually doing everyone a favor. And that to me is what we were missing in like these Web 2 models.
Yeah. So I mean, again, fundamentally just alignment of incentives so that that is the most positive sum way to behave is the way that benefits everybody the most.
Absolutely.
Cool. So moving on to the next question, is the cooperative model appropriate part of the solution?
Yeah, I didn't really get to touch on this a lot. At one point I was gonna have a slide in that like went into more detail here, but like I think the reason I'm like really in this talk like kind of hating on corporations and nation states isn't because they are bad models. Like they have reasons for existing, and lots of them do good things. Like I don't think we need to like just totally be like this system never worked and can't do anything. But what that system has done is made it very easy to, there's a Lindy effect that happens when you have any given set of institutions. This is what I was talking about with Illich, and I'd recommend reading a few things, Silence is a Commons, Deschooling Society, a few other pieces. The work there is talking about the fact that corporations tend to get caught in they're our default. And so when someone says, I want to start a thing with my friends, or like I want to like create some kind of economic gain, they create a corporation. Or when someone says we want to create a democracy, help people like vote on decisions, they create like a modern version of the nation state, which is not just always a democracy. Also, it has a lot of other baggage associated with the like actual mechanisms that are used in various contexts. Cooperatives are a different model that exists. They exist, in the world already. They're not necessarily always Web3. They've existed for a long time, but they're very hard to make. And they're very hard to make partly because historically the regulations have not really allowed for them. It's been much more complicated to create one. The reason that I think cooperatives are powerful here is because crypto naturally, and I also didn't really mention this, aligns incentives by making users owners. So everyone who is participating in a DAO owns the currency basically of that DAO and owns therefore a piece of the actual like system that they are part of. And that is fundamentally cooperative thinking. You're thinking about how do you have shared ownership over the infrastructure or the sort of like tools or communities that you're part of. That was something that was like really hard to do before. That's much easier to do now. And I do think there's benefit in doing things that way versus sticking with, a traditional sort of model.
On top of that, like cooperatives and especially, dApps and DAOs are kind of inherently opt-in type of situations, whereas like nation states, maybe like a corporation could be seen as an opt-in, but a nation state probably not so much. And so they're naturally more cooperative in nature.
The larger an institution gets, the less opt-in it is. I will say as well. Like it becomes harder to avoid. You can't avoid the impact that like JP Morgan has on the economy anymore. Like if JP Morgan does something,
environmental impacts and stuff like that, right? Like when we're talking about multinationals that are in countries where they are having they're taking more than they give to those nations, and clearly the residents of that nation have little to no say in their presence there. So
yes, absolutely true. Yeah.
Cool. So another one here. What do you in the audience think are some of the core value choices? A la Agile Manifesto, we value X over Y for Degen versus Regen. Yep. Did you understand that?
Yeah, like that's a good question. I think that on the one hand, we should value, I think, although, there's a possibility of being too positive, but like we should value like optimism over pessimism. We should value pushing forward technology versus trying to hold it back. I think there's this understanding often, especially, in a lot of circles that are just coming into crypto that, hey, wait, like we haven't, thought carefully enough about this technology. What we haven't thought, I think, carefully about it is like less the technology and more the social layer on top of the technology that we're all sharing. Because it's not just technology at the end of the day. We're all people, we all interact, we all have to figure out where we, what the communities are that we live in. I would say I guess I can't say it's Regen over Degen. It's kind of cheating in this case, but like it's positive sum over zero sum. It's cooperative over competitive. It is fundamentally, smaller localist, I think, as well, versus larger global. So those would be some, initial like thoughts. But I mean, I also would note, like, I probably am not like, it can't just be obviously whatever I say here is like not like the, word on this subject. It's all for us to decide.
For sure. But yeah, I definitely think a lot of things you're saying in terms of focusing towards the more positive or positive sum side of things is that like those are much more inherent elements of human nature. And I think that more of the negative things are more of like a human reaction to the situation we found ourselves.
Yes, absolutely true. Yeah.
Cool. So got a few more. Do you have any time restrictions or anything?
All good.
Awesome. So does the Silicon Valley VC system have the DNA to be included in Regen Finance?
That's actually a really good question, because I think my intuition and the instinct, I think a lot of people would be no, but I don't think that's true necessarily. I think that like there is a possible way for a lot of VCs to be aligned with the values of Web3. I think that, I personally like to pick on them because they're, it's like an easy example of like some of the like problems that we see. But I think that the idea of venture capital is fundamentally the idea of providing, seed funding for like innovation at some level. There is just kind of like someone is voluntarily trading, basically in a lot of cases in DAOs, people are like naturally trading capital for tokens in a way that basically allows for shared ownership. I think the problem comes when, and we see this problem maybe in the current market where the amount of capital in the space is so large that a lot of people are like trying to basically take total ownership over a project. And the important piece is that the majority of a project always needs to still be community owned for it to be successful, for it to, I think, fit into this regen model. And I think that's largely true in Web3. I don't think there's a lot of projects that are like, over 50% VC, like kind of like owned, and like basically like at that point, you run into, especially in a DAO, like, which is just like, there are many, by the way, like there's many DAO models. There's very, one of the things that we get with DAOs that I didn't talk about as well is the ability to run governance experiments. We like have not run many of those in the last 200 years. We get to run like 1,000 of them now, and that's really cool. But like some of those governance experiments, especially if investors own like say like 80% of the group or community, I don't think will be as successful. The beauty, by the way, Web3 is that that's okay, because we will probably not keep those experiments. They will probably, if we're intentional about our values, fall to the wayside over communities that have been more intentional about that distribution.
Yeah, to kind of build on what you were saying, I think when people take shots at VCs, it's not so much that they think they're bad individuals or something like that. It's more just the centralization of wealth, and obviously as per what you were kind of talking about in terms of every participant having the option to be an owner, they wouldn't be excluded from that. It just becomes problematic when they control a disproportionate amount of wealth or the governance process.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. And so how are token owners in a DAO different from shareholders in a company?
So this all depends on the governance model. There's a lot of different governance models for DAOs. There is a possibility of, so one, like it depends on the token and the token's use cases. It too depends on the governance structure. I would say in the case of first let's go to like the token use cases. There are certainly use cases in which what you have is probably basically, ownership over some like traditional organization. Those were things that were tried a lot in like 2017, 2018, even as like, like security tokens. I think the idea now is more that you're, the things that people are mostly part of now that we call DAOs are not really giving you necessarily economic rights. They are giving you governance over core infrastructure. So ENS is a great example of this. What you are governing is how ENS basically develops as a core tool of digital identity in the world, hopefully over the next like 100 years. We have like, a reason to believe that that's like good in itself without necessarily hoping that we get some economic return from that. And that's mostly because if we don't do that, then, maybe we have like whatever meta, VR boardroom adventures that no one wants to be part of. So like, to me, the one piece is just like, we're governing shared infrastructure. We're governing core communities that we're all part of. I think FWB sometimes gets some flack for being like very like hard to get into in terms of like the amount of capital required, but that's a great example of a community that's entirely about like, shared kind of access to events, to knowledge, to a sense of community. And that's what we're trying to do on one hand. On the other hand, there's many different structures for how you vote in these systems. One is one token, one vote. But there's a lot of models that are being experimented with that are much more focused on, for example, NFT-based voting, or kind of collapsed like one person, one vote models. In fact, City DAOs in the context of FWB are doing this. Austin Robbie's done a really good job on Ample doing this. And there's a lot of other models starting to emerge on that front. I think those are just two, but like those are examples of models that we can start to experiment with that I think are pushing us in the right direction. But it's not that token voting is bad. I think token voting has like a lot of trade-offs. And one of the good things about token voting actually is that it is something that you can basically give shared ownership to a community through, which is, naturally by the nature of non-fungible tokens, for example, going to be harder to do. But all of those models, just to be sure, are like way simpler and like way less complicated than what we had to do when it comes to previous models of corporate equity and so forth.
Makes a lot of sense. So there's a question about, so what are some of the environmental / conservation projects you mentioned, and any in particular you think folks should pay attention to?
Definitely KlimaDAO is up there just because it's top of mind. I don't think it's like the only example. EcoDAO just recently launched and is doing some really good work on this front. Regen Network, I would say, is actually a really great, like, long-standing OG climate project in the space. What else? There's, I don't know much about it, but now Kimball Musk has a project on this front, question mark, I don't know enough context there, but shout out there. What else is happening on that front? There's a project Eden DAO, which is coming up around a similar sort of like degen to regen model. But I actually think we probably haven't figured out like the most interesting experiments on this front yet. Like I think there's probably more that can be done here. I think a lot of these will come down to, building probably similar sort of like experiments in the NFT space that have like happened in the DeFi space around regen sort of finance now. Because when we think about regen finance, like that's why those examples come to mind. I'm thinking of KlimaDAO, like Eden are all like based on those sorts of DeFi models. But yeah, NFT kind of like base models would be interesting to see. And then like, I haven't seen a lot of like more localist projects on this front. I've seen a lot of folks that are like taking funding and putting it towards either carbon credits or to, larger charitable organizations doing this work on the ground, which are both great. But I would love to figure out what a more like kind of like a localist model for these tools looks like. So that's, a short list, but yeah, I would love to see more.
I really appreciate that. Definitely seems like a lot of cool innovation in that space for sure. So the next question is outside of silence is a commons. Could you suggest more? So outside, is that the title of something? Outside of silence is a commons?
Silence is a commons. Yeah,
silence is a commons. Oh, outside. Yeah. Okay, sorry. Could you suggest more reading again familiarity in that area?
Yeah, silence is a commons is Ivan Illich's like I think best known work. I think there's a lot of interesting work by John Dewey as well on the nature of public goods, like the historical sort of model of public goods and how we think about them. The other works I would recommend if you're not familiar, it's actually probably more familiar to folks than any of Illich's work, would be the work of Eleanor Ostrom. So principles for governing the commons, like that sort of stuff. There's a lot of reading on this. Like maybe it would make sense to at some point put together like an actual like, curated list actually. So that's maybe that's a to-do, and I'll get back to you. I'll like put something out there.
Yeah, would personally appreciate that because I'm not sure if you could tell, but I was kind of rapidly trying to put those book names into new Google Chrome tabs so I could save them for later.
Right.
But yeah, definitely anything like even like a quick Medium post on kind of high level kind of explanation of the topic and some reading lists would be, I think, very much appreciated by the community. But yeah, that's it for questions. Really appreciate you taking the time. There was definitely an extended Q&A period, but I found it to be very, very engaging. So really appreciate you taking the time to stick around for that, Scott.
No worries. Yeah, it was great to have that Q&A. I kind of like went rapid fire through the presentation. And I was like, oh yeah, it was like
for sure,
50 minutes. I didn't really time it in my head, but that was great. Yeah.
Obviously the content you shared kind of got the wheels turning for a lot of people. And I think that's probably the most questions that we fielded for a single presenter at this point in the conference. So
amazing. That's great. Well, thank you.
Is there ways that you would be agreeable to people contacting you, like Twitter, something like that, if you want to maybe throw it in the chat for people to be able to reach out to you and ask you any more questions directly?
For sure. Let me actually find my Twitter. There we go. And just send me a DM. That's, oh wait, I'm about to put it in the Q&A section. It's a question for myself, I guess. This is the easiest way. I'm happy to take, questions over email as well. And if, you want to get involved in the DAO, I mean, Gitcoin is still growing. We're still, finding more ways for people to get involved. So if you have particular skills that you want to put to use for public goods, just reach out, happy to get you involved. And Grants Round 12, as I mentioned, is happening right now. I didn't really explain anything about how quadratic funding works. So that's, something maybe for another time, but check out the Talix blog for a lot of historical results and explanations on that mechanism. And even, a few DAI donations basically result in a huge amount of matching from a number of partners that we have in the matching pool. So please participate, and thank you again.